Hey folks, one of the really powerful features of Liblab is its ability to be integrated into your CI/CD pipeline. So the idea is when you're fully set up, every time you update your API spec, a new SDK is generated, you can review that, approve that, and then automatically create a package that you publish to the package manager of your choice. In this video, I'm going to take you through a tutorial we've built that shows you this entire process, starting right from creating an account all the way through to building an SDK that gets published to a package manager. In this particular case, I'm going to be using Python to generate a Python SDK and publish it all the way through to PyPI. Now, this video is based off a tutorial that we have available on our developer site, link down below and in the notes. And let's work through this tutorial together. So the first thing we need is the Liblab CLI installed and logged in. Now, to use the Liblab CLI, I need an account with Liblab. So let's actually show the process for signing up right now. Start off at liblab.com, hit the big blue Get Started button. So I'm going to sign up, enter my email address, and then a password. There we go. Right, it's going to send me an email. So I'm just going to verify that. We're done. And I've now created my account with Liblab with my 15 free credits to get going. So now I need to install the Liblab CLI and then log in using my new account. You can install the Liblab CLI with npm or homebrew if you're on a Mac. I'm going to install it with npm. So npm install -g liblab, and then I'm going to log in. Liblab login. Confirmed. Logged in. I'm not actually going to use the Liblab CLI to generate an SDK in this video. I'm just going to use it to generate an access token so I can automate CLI generation. So back to the tutorial. So I have my Liblab CLI installed and we're logged in. I have an API spec. I'm actually going to use a dummy API spec. I'm going to use the pet store. Everyone loves the pet store, so let's use the pet store. I have a GitHub account, and I have an account with PyPI in my case. I want to publish a Python SDK to PyPI. So what are the steps that we're going to take to build this end-to-end flow? So the first step, we need to create what's called a control repo. I'll dig into what that is in just a second. Then we need to create SDK repos. Again, dig into that in a second. We need to create some tokens, Liblab tokens, GitHub tokens, and package manager tokens. I need to update my API spec and config file in my control repo. Dig into that in a second. Then when we've got some SDKs generated, we'll have a PR to merge. Then we can create a release in GitHub to publish to PyPI, and then we can verify the publish. So 8 steps kind of go end to end. So the central driver for your CI/CD workflow is what we call a control repo. This is a repository that contains everything you need to control your SDK generation. This is kind of the source of truth for your automated SDK generation. Inside this repository, you would have your API spec potentially, if you're not accessing it from a API endpoint. You'd have your Liblab config file, and this config file defines how your SDK is built. Things like the name of the SDK, the spec file that you're pointing to, what programming languages you want, and various other configuration. You can also have hooks code in here, and hooks are the Liblab way of customizing your request response cycle in your SDK. So you can intercept requests before they get sent to the API, manipulate them, intercept responses when they come back, and all that code lives inside this repo. In addition, you also want to have some GitHub Actions in this repo, and this is what triggers the whole CI/CD workflow. So you have actions that look for changes in your spec, your config file, your hooks code, and if changes are found, it will regenerate your SDK and raise a pull request for you. So let's start by creating a control repo, and to make things easier, we've actually got a GitHub template that you can use to create the control repo. So hit this blue button here, and we can create this repo. We'll call this Jim's Pet Store SDK, and we'll go off and create this. Okay, my control repo has now been created. I have my liblab config.json in here, set up for my spec.json that's included in the repo. A few languages are chosen, a few options already configured, and obviously I can go through and update this config file. We'll do that later on. Spec file here as well. This is the basic pet store spec. Again, I can change this to my spec, or I can point my config file at a remote spec. Don't have any hooks code. That's something I'd add if I wanted to add hooks. But I do have these GitHub Actions set up. So for example, generate SDK monitors for any changes to my config file, my spec, hooks if I had them. And if they're found, it will regenerate the SDK and raise a pull request. So this is my configured control repo. And in a minute, we'll go through and update this to actually reflect what I want to build. The next step is SDK repos. So where we have our control repo that contains our source of truth for the inputs for the SDK generation, our SDK repos are the outputs. So every time I generate an SDK, I want to put this in a particular repository. This is kind of a fairly standard pattern. You'd have one repo for your TypeScript SDK, one for Python, one for Go, one for C#, and so on and so on and so on. So once again, we have some template repos that can make it really quick to generate these SDK repos. And I'm just going to do Python. We're just going to stick to Python for this video. So I hit the blue button, generate Python one. I'm going to call this Jim's Pet Store Python SDK and create this. Now my SDK repo, there's not much here. There's a README and there's some GitHub Actions. If I look at the GitHub Actions, we actually have a publish action. This has been set up, so when we actually do a release in GitHub, this will build the Python SDK, build the wheel, and actually upload this to PyPI. So we've kind of got that automation built into GitHub Action in our SDK repo. Now that we have our control repo and our SDK repos, I need to configure some tokens. So I need some secrets set to do the automation. I need a Liblab token, which means that I can run SDK generation through a GitHub action as me. And then I need GitHub tokens so I can create pull requests in my SDK repos. So let's start with creating a Liblab token. So this is what I need the Liblab CLI for. I'm not going to use the CLI for my SDK generation. I'm just using it to generate my token. So I go Liblab token, create, and I'm going to call my token GitHub token. Now by default, this token lasts 90 days, but I could change that if I wanted to. Good practice right now, set a calendar reminder for 90 days time to renew this token. Now the only thing I need from this token is this middle bit here. Just this middle bit. I don't need the underscores, I just need this middle bit here. So I'm going to take a copy of this token, and this is the only time I'm going to be able to see this. If I lose this token, I have to generate a new one. For security reasons, we don't want to keep these store these tokens in plain text, so you only ever get to see them once. And then what I do with my Liblab token is I set that in my control repo's action sequence. So here's my control repo here. Go to settings for my repository. Under secrets and variables, I choose actions, and then I create a repository secret. I drop my value in there, and the name I want for this is Liblab token. Added. Now what this secret means is, if I go back to my action here, show the action code, when I generate the SDK, this token is used to authenticate with Liblab. So when this action runs, this action is running as me using my token. That way it's got access to my accounts, access to, right now I've got 15 free credits, it's got access to those. Obviously when I upgrade my account, I'll have access to the full suite of what my account offers, and then I better see that I've generated this SDK. So this allows Liblab to act as me. Now the next token I need is a GitHub token. And the reason I need this is, if I just zip back to the action, once I've created my SDK, I need to raise a pull request for that SDK into the SDK repos. There's no point in just generating an SDK if I don't put the code somewhere. This Liblab PR at the end of my action generates a pull request into my SDK repos. For that, it needs permissions. For that, I need a fine-grained access token. So let's create one of those now. So I do that from GitHub. I go down to settings. Right down the side is developer settings, personal access tokens, and I want to create a fine-grained token. These tokens give a lot more control. I can choose the repositories they apply to. I can choose the permissions they have, and it kind of gives me a lot more control in the token I create. A classic token kind of has access to everything. I don't want that. I want this fine-grained token. So to generate a new token, I'm going to call this Liblab Pet Store PR token. Expiration date is 90 days, so it's the same as my Liblab token. That way I've got one calendar reminder to update my tokens. Then I can choose what repositories I want access to. I could grant it access to all public, all repositories, but that's not the best way. Best practice, only select repositories. So I'm going to choose Python SDK. I want my Pet Store Python SDK. That's the one I want. So just one repository. That's all it has access to. Now, if I decide later on that I want to add TypeScript SDK, C# SDK, Java SDK, I would need to regenerate this token with using those SDK repos. For now, it's just tied to one, and I can't change it once it's been generated. Next, I need to apply permissions on that repository. There are 5 permissions that we need. First thing is commit statuses. I need read and write commit status so that my PR can commit. I need read and write to contents so I can actually create a branch, upload code. I need read on metadata, and you get that automatically. So every token has to have that. I need to read and write on pull requests because I'm creating a pull request. And then I need read and write on workflows, because some of these pull requests actually create GitHub Actions as part of the SDK. And that's it. This are my 5 permissions. Then I generate token. Once again, I can only see this token now. Once this token is gone, I will not be able to see it again. So I have to copy that and use it. So in this case, now that it's generated, I need to go back to my repository and set this as a secret. So in my repository, settings, secrets and variables, action secrets. There's our Liblab token, new one in here. And then this needs to be created as Liblab GitHub token. There we go. That's created my 2 secrets. Now I want to do an end-to-end publish. So as I'm playing with secrets right now is a good time for me to create a package manager token. This will allow my SDK repo to automatically publish to PyPI in this particular case. So what I need to do, I need to go to PyPI. I need to go to account settings. Under account settings, I can create an API token. Add an API token, call this Jim's Pet Store token. Now I can choose the scope for this token. Now right now I don't have a package, so I'm going to set the scope to be all projects, and this will allow my publishing to automatically create the brand new PyPI project and upload a new SDK to PyPI. Now going forward, once I've got that, I should probably just scope this just that one project. Or maybe even better, I should create the project first and then scope it to that project. But for now, I'm just going to do all projects and I will deal with this later. So create token. Once again, I'll only see this token once. So I'll copy this token. I'm going to go to my SDK repo. So not the control repo this time. This time it's the SDK repo. And I go actions, secrets, new repository secret, paste that in there. And then I need to call this secret PyPI token. So I've done that. That's now configured. So we've now configured all the tokens. So in our control repo, we have tokens to run Liblab and then create a pull request with the generated SDK using the GitHub token. In the SDK repo, I have the token to publish to PyPI. So my control repo is what I use to drive SDK generation. So it needs access to Liblab and GitHub to create a pull request into my SDK repo, and then my SDK repo needs access to PyPI to publish. So that is the PyPI token. So that's got everything configured. I've literally built my pipeline. Now it's time to kick everything off and actually make it work. And to do this, I need to update my spec and config file to kind of get my SDK generation happening. So in my control repo, I'm just going to tap dots to load up vscode.dev. And in here, I'm going to update the config file. Now I'm not going to update the spec. I'm just going to use the Swagger pet store that's here, but I do need to update my config file. So first thing, give it a name. I'll call this Jim's Pet Store SDK. So identify that. Just going to do Python for now. So let's get rid of the others. Don't need TypeScript and C#, so I can get rid of all that. So what do I need to set now for this to happen? So the first thing, to build my SDK, I want to think about what do I want to call it. So I want to call this Jim's Pet Store SDK. And this is what will go into my pyproject.toml, and this will drive the name of the project in PyPI. It's got to be unique in PyPI, so I'm just saying it's Jim's Pet Store SDK, should be unique. And then I need to think about where I'm going to be creating the pull request. So in my config file, I define the SDK repos that everything goes into. So the first thing is the org. I need to put my GitHub org, my GitHub username in here. So we know that all the SDKs need to have pull requests raised in repos in the Jim Bob Bennett org. That's me. And then I need to give my repo a name. And this, I called it Jim's Pet Store Python SDK. So I need to drop that into my GitHub repo name. This tells Liblab to build my SDK in Python only, called Jim's Pet Store SDK. And then when it comes to raise a pull request into Jim Bob Bennett / Jim's Pet Store Python SDK. That's what I need for my config file. Don't have any hooks. So I can now commit this change. Dating config file. When we're using vscode.dev, this is pushing this directly to my repo. So when I go back to my repository, you'll see an action has been kicked off. So whenever you commit anything to any of the files, it kicks off this action. Not the first time around, because we don't want to do it when you create the repo. This will kick off this action to generate SDKs. So this can go off and generate the SDKs for me. In fact, if I load this up, you'll see setting everything up, installing Liblab, building, and creating a pull request. And cleaning up. Nice. So that action is now done. And what that will do, that will actually create a pull request in my SDK repo. So the next step is to review and merge that pull request. If I go back to my SDK repo, you'll now see under pull requests, I have Liblab SDK update 100. This is the pull request. It's literally just been raised automatically by the action. Now it's attributed to me because this was using my GitHub token when the pull request ran. Obviously, if I wanted to fully automate this in an organizational setting, the token might be owned by the organization or some kind of bot, whatever you want. But it's my token, so it's got my face on it. And if I actually look at this file's changed, there's a lot of changes here because this is the first version of the SDK. So this is the very first time it's been created, so it's creating all the files. So I'm going to merge this pull request and delete the branch. Now, if I made a change to my config file, made a change to my spec, added hooks code, when it generates a new pull request, it'll just be those changes. So it won't be the full big, everything's changed, it'll just be those changes, like a new endpoint or a new field on a request object, for example. So that's got my SDK PR merged. Now I'm ready to actually release to PyPI. And for that, it's all based off a GitHub release. So I've got all my code in here. From my SDK repo, create a new release. We'll create a new tag. Oh, and call this tag v1.0.0. Call my release v1.0.0 first version. Publish the release. Now that's published, if I go to the actions, you'll see this has started an action to publish to PyPI. So the action that comes by default in the template repo is configured to build your Python package, build the wheel, deploy it to PyPI every time you do a release in GitHub. So it's just processing, just running, done. So the final step in the tutorial is verify that the publish has happened. So if I go back to PyPI, go to my projects, Jim's Pet Store SDK. This is my new Python SDK, generated, deployed to PyPI. What have we done here? Let's do a quick recap. I started by installing the Liblab CLI and created myself a Liblab account so that I could run Liblab. I then created a control repo. This is the repository that's your source of truth for SDK generation. It contains your Liblab config file, your spec, hooks code, things like that. It also contains GitHub Actions that I've triggered when you change your config file or your spec to automatically regenerate your SDK and raise a pull request into your SDK repo. Then create an SDK repo for Python, and that contains actions to allow me to publish my SDKs to PyPI. I created tokens for Liblab and GitHub that are set in actions secrets for my control repo so that Liblab can run and raise a pull request. I created a package manager token for PyPI, which was set inside my SDK repo so that my SDK repo could publish to PyPI. Then I updated my config file. I named my Python project. I pointed it at my SDK repos so they could raise the PRs. And then on push to the repository, it ran the action to create a pull request in the SDK repo. I merged that. I then created a release in my SDK repo, and that triggered another action that published to PyPI. And then I saw my SDK built and published in PyPI. So that's it. That's how you do a working deploy from end to end with Liblab. Check out developers.liblab.com for more tutorials and to learn more about Liblab. See you all later.